towards the end of my PhD, I saw a video of these guys from Team Novo Nordisk cycling up a mountain. And I was like, this doesn't match up with what I'm seeing every day. I need to find out how this is working because I want to transfer that into what I'm doing every day. I've seen it's possible to do any type of exercise, definitely possible to live a healthy, active lifestyle. People who do live with type 1 and are able to support you.
Welcome to the Upside Strength podcast. In this new episode, I'm happy to chat with Sam Scott, CEO and founder of the Enhanced D app that helps diabetics manage their condition with a holistic and integrative approach. Before founding Enhanced D, Sam worked for 5 years as the head of research with Team Novo Nordisk, an all-diabetes professional cycling team. In this episode, we talk about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, what causes these conditions, and how they can be managed effectively by addressing physical activity and appropriate nutritional strategies. This was a fascinating episode, and I hope that through conversations like these, more information will become available to the people that need it the most. Thanks to All You Need Nutrition for sponsoring this episode. If you want to know more about the great products that they offer and why I decided to work with them, make sure you stick around till the end of the episode. Now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Sam Scott. Sam, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on. For the listeners that don't know you yet, can you give us a brief intro on who you are and what you do?
My name's Sam Scott. I'm currently CEO and co-founder of a startup called Enhanced. What we're doing is aiming to help everyone with diabetes to exercise effectively and also kind of in a fun, engaging way. My background is as an academic. So I did a PhD in the UK in Liverpool, focusing on exercise physiology, how to get people into exercise who weren't previously doing so. A large focus of that was on type 1 diabetes. So this is there. I traveled the world a bit, working in different labs, first in Toronto, doing postdocs there, focusing on this. Then moved over to Switzerland in Bern, where I was working in a hospital there, doing clinical work. And in the meantime, I'd also been doing a lot of work around13professional sports, especially cycling with people with type 1 diabetes. And now I'm in Ticino, in the south of Switzerland, still here, and this seems to be home at the moment.
Okay, good to hear. It is a very nice country we're lucky to live in, and it's cool to see that you've been around the block and you've stuck around for a little bit. Let's start from the beginning. Where did your interest in diabetes come from?
So it's important to kind of say up front that I don't live with type 1 diabetes myself. So I've always been interested in like human physiology. My PhD, when I started this, I would say it was split into two halves. One was very kind of molecular physiology, where I was doing a lot of microscope work, and the other half was applied exercise projects with a big focus on type 1 diabetes. When I first started this, my thought from the start was that the kind of microscope work, the real sort of in the lab physiology was where I wanted to go. And I had this plan to go and do postdocs in the likes of Copenhagen and really focus on this type of work. But when I was kind of really starting to meet people living with type 1 diabetes and started doing a lot of the projects that I was working on, I noticed that, first of all, there was a real scarcity of work that had been done in this area. And there was a real need from almost every single person I met to kind of connect with other people who also had type 1 diabetes and to learn more about how they could manage their blood glucose safely and effective around exercise. When I first started doing this work, which was probably around 2014, 2015, technology like continuous glucose monitors were not anywhere near as common as they were today. There weren't so many community groups that were sort of available. There wasn't so many people focusing on exercise. So A lot of the people I was speaking to said that they felt as though they were the only person living with the condition. They didn't feel like there was any real resources to go on that. And so I changed my mind and decided this is what I want to do all the time, really focus on this area. And that was the motivation for switching plan and pursuing this 100%.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. I'm excited to talk to you today about all things diabetes. I'm gonna learn a ton along with all the listeners, I hope. So maybe let's dive right into it, and let's take the big picture to start. What is diabetes? And then we'll go into the details of the type 1, type 2, and all the considerations around it. But if you could maybe define it at a at a kind of a broad level, and then I'd love to dive into the molecular stuff with you as well a little bit if you're keen.
Yeah, so absolutely. So diabetes as a whole is a very kind of big umbrella term which covers different types. The most common types being type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. So this is something that happens very quickly in terms of onset. The individual will experience symptoms, which will be things like they'll lose a lot of weight rapidly. They'll be very, very thirsty, like constantly needing to drink, but constantly needing to go to the toilet as well. And this is a situation where their body, for some unknown reason, has kind of attacked its own beta cells. So these are the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. So they stop making this hormone very rapidly, and it causes their blood glucose to go very high because they're not able to manage this. The high blood glucose causes these symptoms of the thirst, of the needing to go to the toilet, and also the losing the weight. And this requires kind of as quick as possible action to put the individual on to lifelong insulin therapy. So from then on, they would require kind of constant or very regular blood glucose monitoring, either through regularly checking blood samples or using continuous glucose monitors. And they will have to manage their nutrition, their insulin dosing to maintain safe and healthy blood glucose. The most common type of diabetes is type 2 diabetes. So this is a chronic condition, so it happens over many years. It tends to happen in older people, well, over the age of kind of 40 plus, as opposed to like younger, but you are seeing nowadays even children who are at risk of type 2 diabetes. What happens here is this is usually a consequence of lifestyle factors related to nutrition or sedentary behavior, inactivity, but it also has a strong genetic component in some cases. Basically here it's a situation where your body stops responding to or it kind of overcompensates with the high blood glucose, which is caused by like having a high sugar diet, for example. Your body starts producing more insulin to cope. Eventually it gets to the point where your pancreas basically says, no, I require insulin as well. So this is kind of happens over a longer term. It's usually managed with medications like metformin, which help to manage blood glucose, but eventually the person will need to go on to regular blood glucose monitoring and potentially insulin as well.
Okay. My first question would be: is either of those reversible?
So with type 1 diabetes, no, it's not. But there is a lot of intensive research that's going on at the moment with the idea of either stem cell therapy or other very advanced kind of technologies to look to reverse pancreas kind of taking the pancreas from a healthy individual and placing it into transplantation.
Right.
But this is something that's still there's a long way to go on the science. It's not something that I'm like so familiar with, but I know a lot of people are really working hard on the idea of therapies to sort of cure type 1 diabetes. With type 2 diabetes, I think it really depends on the stage at which you're at. The earlier that you intervene with when you're at risk, when you're first having kind of symptoms of pre-diabetes, this is the best time to kind of intervene. But there are studies that have shown that people with diagnosed type 2 diabetes can be reversed. This would be with things such as meal replacement therapies. So there are studies which have used very low calorie, like liquid diet replacements with the idea of replacing or kind of looking as a way to reverse or at least help with the symptoms of type 2 diabetes.
Okay. If we go back to the mechanism underlying all this, so we spoke about blood sugar, and so can you talk us through again the mechanism through which insulin mediates blood sugar levels? Let's take an example. You start with the meal, and then I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, so basically, one of the things which I find really amazing is how good your body is at keeping itself in this safe position. So an average male adult only has about 1 teaspoon of sugar in their bloodstream in the fasted state, so about 5 grams. So a very, very small amount. And basically your body is trying to keep to a point where this is kept around this level. You need this amount to have for kind of normal bodily function in, for example, providing enough energy for the brain. So the brain predominantly metabolizes glucose. So if your glucose levels drop lower than that level, you will experience hypoglycemia or low blood glucose. And this is why you get symptoms where there'll be like fainting or this kind of thing, because the brain really needs this to function. On the other hand, if it goes too high, which happens where people have kind of chronic or long-term a higher blood glucose, and it's not by much, it's only kind of doubling that 5 grams of glucose or 4 grams of glucose, you put yourself at great risk of damage, particularly to smaller blood vessels and nerve cells. This is because glucose becomes toxic in this case where it's at too high a level. So your body is really trying to maintain this equilibrium, this kind of really tight balance. When you eat a meal, think about how much glucose or sugar is contained in a normal healthy meal. It's quite a lot that you're kind of exposing your body to, and you think about the amazing job that your body is doing to kind of manage the way that it's taking that on, so that it's balanced between having enough glucose for brain function, but not too low so that you experience hypoglycemia. So upon eating a meal, just like on a very kind of simplified version level of this, your body will kind of sense this. It will release insulin. Insulin acts. There's 2 very kind of basic functions of this. One is that it increases blood flow. So it will increase blood flow so that the nutrients, the glucose, all the rest of it is being delivered to where it needs to in the body, and also so that insulin itself is being delivered more kind of quickly and effectively to where it's needed. So it does this by acting on small blood vessels called arterioles, which will dilate, they'll open up, and then your blood will go towards where it's needed. Then what happens is that the insulin is acting on receptors at the muscle, and it's kind of unlocking the ability to take that glucose into your muscle cells. So your muscle represents a really good storage site for glucose. So glucose is taken in, it's either used as energy directly, or it's being taken in and stored as glycogen. So this is the store that is then used during exercise.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So if I understood correctly, the insulin helps essentially move itself around to increasing blood flow, and it allows better distribution of nutrients to the body through this increased blood flow. And at the same time, it's the key that opens the door so that the sugar can get into the muscle and either be used or stored. Right. Is
Yeah.
there any interaction between the insulin and the liver stores of glycogen? Is there anything going on there, or is that a different mechanism?
Yeah, so your liver is also a really important store of glucose. The way in which the liver is taking on glucose is it can be directly from the gut there, or it can be fed through. So yeah, but it doesn't seem as though it's a very kind of it's not used in the same way as it is at the muscles to kind of act on those receptors to pull glucose into the liver. Yeah, it's a very simplified explanation of what I gave. You've kind of got this sort of, it's this balance of these different hormones that are acting to bring glucose down and to bring glucose up. And it's all the time thinking about how do I keep within that 1 teaspoon of sugar, basically.
Right. And going back to the type 1 and type 2, so type 1 is when the pancreas stops secreting or stop making, what do you say, beta cells? Is that what it's called? And those,
So yeah, it stops. So the beta cells are destroyed,
right,
and they're unable to produce insulin of their own.
right. And so
Yeah.
then your blood glucose would keep going up and up if it wasn't managed, and that's no bueno for our vessels. You said that it damages the nerves too?
Yes. So over a long term, so this is why you want to avoid higher blood glucose over the long term. So um, with diabetes, the risk of going higher with your blood glucose, there are short-term risks, i.e. over hours or kind of day or two. And this would be that your blood glucose would go too high. In compensation, because your cells are not able to take the glucose into the muscle. So the glucose is there, it's in the bloodstream, but you need the insulin to take that in. As a consequence, your body looks for different ways to start sort of producing energy, and it starts going down the fat burning route and starts producing ketones. What these ketones do is they make the blood more acidic. And so if you're in a situation where you don't have enough insulin to take this glucose in, your body starts producing these ketones, blood more acidic, and you reach a situation which is called diabetic ketoacidosis. So this is really the short-term risk for somebody with type 1 diabetes. This is why it's very important to start on insulin therapy as soon as kind of these symptoms are noticed. This is unfortunately one of the most common causes of death or severe illness in type 1 diabetes. And unfortunately as well, quite often at the point of diagnosis, people often are hospitalized because they're in diabetic ketoacidosis.
Mm.
So this is the short-term risk. Over the long term, having long-term exposure to higher blood glucose levels, and this applies to everybody really, regardless of the type of diabetes. What happens is that the smaller cells are being more and more exposed to this higher concentration of glucose, and it just damages them. And this is why the main complications of diabetes tend to be things like problems with the eyes, retinopathy. So blindness is something that's unfortunately a greater risk. You have problems in the kidneys because you have kind of smaller blood vessels there. Problems in the feet and in the toes as well, where there's smaller blood vessels, and also the nerves in those, like in your feet in particular. You're not able to kind of feel if there's if there's something rubbing against your foot. You don't notice that, and in addition, the healing is not so good, and this is why you see problems there. So this is why you would want to avoid that chronic high blood glucose.
Okay, that's interesting. So you talked about the short term and then the long term effects or problems that we might encounter with that diabetes. So just to understand, what is it because of the high blood glucose concentration together with the ketone concentration that things go wrong? Or because I'm thinking of ketosis without the high blood glucose side. Is that also a problem long term, or is it really this coupled with the high blood sugar?
Yeah, so I'm aware that there's kind of a lot of kind of complicated uh, sort of mechanisms, and like the endocrinology and stuff is quite complicated. So it's not the fact that it's the combination of having the high glucose and the ketones together. It's just that the situation of not having enough insulin leads to the different way that your body tries to compensate through producing energy in a different pathway, and that leads to the ketones.
Right.
There are situations where you can have this situation of diabetic ketoacidosis without high blood glucose, and this is something that has been noticed when people are taking certain medications. So there are some medications which we don't need to go into too much. For example, SGLT2 inhibitors. So these are a medication which they alter the way in which glucose is being reabsorbed from the kidneys. And what happens with these is they're really good for a lot of people, but they can mask this situation of ketoacidosis because your body is kind of getting rid of the extra glucose through the kidneys, and perhaps you've not recognized that you don't have enough insulin on board, so you can kind of experience ketoacidosis without the higher blood glucose. This is a very specific example. It's just to illustrate that like one does not equal the other. It's something where, unfortunately, with type 1 diabetes, the monitoring is so important. So I can't overstate the amount of kind of constant monitoring of glucose levels, and then also kind of really sort of building up an awareness about risk of other things such as ketoacidosis, especially if you're taking things like those medications.
Something I'm trying to understand here is we think about ketosis as in my mind, ketosis is a positive metabolic state. I guess it depends on the perspective, but I never saw it as a bad thing. Would you agree with that? That in and of itself, ketosis is not quote unquote dangerous?
Well, I think it's under different situations.
Yeah.
So if um, if you don't have type 1 diabetes, you're always going to be in a situation where your body is very good at adapting to whatever state it's put into.
Yeah.
With type 1 diabetes in particular, there are many people that I've met who are following low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, that kind of thing, and they say that they feel great, it works very well for them. But what I do know is that they need to monitor themselves more closely. It's
Right.
something that you just need to have an awareness of.
Yeah.
You need to know that that's what's happening. That's the critical part of it.
Yeah, could we, if we wanted to simplify, could we say that diabetes is a type of metabolic inflexibility, so to speak, where the body cannot adapt to the situation that it's in? And if in the other case, when you don't have diabetes, your body can use sugars as fuel, your body can run off of fats if you expose it for a long enough time, and especially if you take the sugar away for a long enough period of time, and your body can is more flexible in that case and can adapt, whereas somebody with diabetes won't be able to, and that seems to lead to the issues that you mentioned previously.
This is a really interesting question. And I think it's actually more kind of there's a lot to this. So we can try and sort of break it down in terms of, so with type 1 diabetes, it will depend on the individual and
Mm.
their level of um, sort of their level of fitness or their level of sporting, like how much exercise they do. Because in terms of metabolic flexibility, I would look at this more as the ability to shift between the use of different fuels
Right.
in accordance to how you need them for the type of
Mm.
exercise that you're doing.
Mm.
Um, if we move to type 2 diabetes, I would I would broadly speaking define this group as very metabolically inflexible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason is that they are less able to switch between different types of fuels when they kind of start exercising. Um, there's a really kind of nice way to visualize this when you start looking at muscle samples from athletes, people who are kind of lean but not athletes, not doing exercise, and people who are very obese or have type 2 diabetes. And what you find if you look on the in the muscle of the people with type 2 diabetes or obesity is there's a lot of fat droplets there, a lot of lipid droplets in the muscle. Also, if you were to analyze the mitochondria, so these are the little kind of powerhouse of the cell. This is what is acting to sort of produce the energy that's required. So you find that those are kind of not in a great shape. You'll have less mitochondria. They're not so good quality. On the other end of the spectrum, you have your athletes. What they have is a lot of lipid droplets as well, but the way that they are organized, the structure of those, the placement of them around the mitochondria is completely different. And to finish off, the people who are inactive, who don't have diabetes, they don't have much fat in their muscle cells at all. There's not that much. And so you might think that, why do the athletes have all of this there? And the reason is because they have a great amount of flexibility within their physiology to sort of adapt and use different fuel sources. And this is called the athlete's paradox, this idea of having lots of fats within the muscle as well, lots of lipid. But what happens there is that the athlete is in a situation where these lipid droplets are actually being arranged in a really kind of in the most effective and most efficient way possible, so that when the athlete starts exercising, they are using fat stores, they are using these lipid droplets for as long as possible, so that they are able to preserve the carbohydrate stores that they have in their muscle, so that they can go as long as possible. They're also very efficient at doing this. They're using less oxygen to do it. But on the other side, on the type 2 diabetes, the structure of different proteins around these lipid droplets, the way in which the mitochondria are placed, also the size of these lipid droplets, make it very difficult for them to use it. And so when somebody who has type 2 diabetes, obesity, starts exercising, they will mostly use carbohydrates. If you put somebody on a bike and do a physiological test, and you look at the type of fuel that they're using, even from a relatively lower intensity of exercise, they're not optimizing the fuel that they're doing. They're not flexible in the way that they're able to shift between that, whereas an athlete is really good at doing that. And if we shift the focus back to type 1 diabetes, the reason it was difficult to explain that exactly is because it's there are people who have type 1 diabetes who are athletes. They're able to compete really at a high level. They would have this high level of flexibility to be able to switch between different fuel sources because their physiology has adapted to the training that they're doing. Mm-hmm. It's just that they are relying on the administration of exogenous insulin. They just need to make sure that they are managing their blood glucose and managing their nutrition for this safe glucose level. But the way in which they are using the fuels doesn't necessarily become like inflexible, if you like.
Yeah, that's really interesting, as it adds that spectrum of activity, right, and exercise to this metabolic situation that is diabetes. One last question before we dive into all these exercise and nutrition consideration with the different types of diabetes. In my mind, before you said it earlier, type 1 diabetes was, or I had understood or heard or read somewhere, or thought I read, that it was a genetic condition. Would you say that is there a big genetic component to type 1 diabetes, or is the autoimmune manifestation with maybe a trigger that that brought it to life? Is that more common? Which one would you say it is, if we can even split those two?
So no one knows exactly the cause or the exact trigger that leads to type 1 diabetes. There does appear to be a strong genetic component. I know quite a few people who have another family member who has type 1 diabetes as well. There is evidence that there are some genetic links to it. Interestingly, there also seems to be environmental links to it, in the fact that there are certain countries around the world that tend to have a lower incidence of this. There are certain hotspots in the world that have higher incidences, and there's been different hypotheses put forward as to why this would be. So I think the highest incidence is in Finland. Canada also has a very high incidence.
Okay.
But on the lower side, certain places in China have less. And there's, interestingly, some evidence that shows that if you take somebody who's originally from one of those other countries and move them to a place where there's the higher risk, they assume the higher risk of the location where they've moved to. And this has led to different hypotheses around whether it's to do with different things, such as one has been sunlight, so kind of sunlight exposure, some of these northern countries. Another one has been to do with something to do with nutrition or something like that, or there's been other hypotheses around like hygiene hypotheses, that kind of thing, but there isn't a clear reason or kind of link. Nowadays, there's in kind of very recent times, there's been a big push towards people doing screenings where people are looking to see whether their risk of type 1 diabetes is particularly high, so that they can be sort of monitored and make sure that they are receiving the care that they need, like immediately before there becomes the risk of like an acute emergency when they're diagnosed. But yeah.
What's your opinion? What do you think is most likely when it comes to those northern countries having seemingly higher rates of type 1 diabetes? Is it when you said northern countries like Finland and Canada, my mind went to mitochondria right away. I found some information online about the uncoupling of respiration within the mitochondria and how that might change depending on which latitude you come from genetically. So to make it to try and keep it simple, if you're from a northern country where it's cold, your body adapts to essentially be less efficient from a mitochondrial coupling standpoint, meaning it makes more heat with the process of respiration. Whereas if you're, say, on the equator, well, obviously you don't need to heat your body that much because the environment is doing that for you. So you have a quote unquote tighter coupling inside the mitochondria, meaning the mitochondria is more efficient. Have you heard of this before? Do you know if it has anything to do, or could it fit within that diabetes model that you're talking about?
I've not heard of that one before. With type 1 diabetes, I'm not sure that that would fit in exactly, because it seems as though it's linked to this autoimmune response.
Yeah.
It seems as though it's something that's very much linked to the immune system. The other thing that I didn't mention before is the fact that very commonly people say that they experience like the flu or a very severe cold or some other illness, and then they're diagnosed shortly after. So there's there seems to be that it could be that there's also some kind of like trigger that happens in
Yeah.
terms of that, or perhaps there's some way in which the immune system is weakened some way, and then leads to kind of triggering something that was already at risk that was
Mm,
there.
mm,
In all honesty, I'm not really kind of, I'm not kind of sure. I think
yeah.
it's,
So, so
yeah.
do vitamin D, in my mind, has quite a bit to do with our immune function and our immune system. And so, when you talk about sunlight, do you think that might be a more likely cause or factor, however it plays in? Something I heard recently, which I thought was interesting, is I forget who said it, but they said that there was there was no flu season, there was a vitamin D deficiency season, and how essentially in the winter, depending on where you are on the planet, in the winter months you get the sun is lower on the horizon, and it needs to be, I think it's above 30 degrees in the sky so that you actually do get or do generate vitamin D. Otherwise, obviously, you can see the sun, you can feel the sun, but you might not have enough to get that vitamin D effect. Do you think it has anything to do with this?
Um, it could be linked. I mean, in terms of the way that you see the risk changing according to, so the countries that have the lower risk are ones which don't have so much of that kind of seasonal shift
Mm,
in the sunlight hours. So it could be linked. I would be lying if I said I kind of know. I'd just be
right.
kind of guessing. To be
Yeah.
honest, it's not something that I know too much about. Yeah,
All
but
right. Well,
it's interesting. Could be all in there.
okay. So we'll have to wait and see what emerges from the research in coming years. So let's dive into type 1 diabetes to start, and talk about, I believe there's a mechanism called non-insulin mediated glucose uptake.
Mhm.
Uh, so can you talk about this and how it relates to type 1 and exercise?
Yeah, so before, what we did was we talked about kind of the hormone insulin. So insulin's job is to act on the muscles to lower blood glucose. Does this by um, stimulating what's called glucose transporters to kind of, they move to the edge of the muscle cell and pull in the glucose. Another interesting kind of phenomenon is that muscle contractions or exercise, this has a similar but like different pathway that leads to this same effect. So when you're starting to do exercise, it will stimulate these metabolic pathways, which will cause these glucose transporters. It's GLUT4, that's what they're called in the muscle, to take up glucose. So with type 1 diabetes, this is really interesting because these mechanisms are not impacted at all by the fact that you stop making insulin. And this is why exercise is so kind of interesting, but also really challenging for people with type 1 diabetes. So you're in a situation where you're relying on insulin to manage your blood glucose in everyday life. But if you want to start exercising, you need to consider the fact that you will all of a sudden have these pathways triggered that causes increased glucose into the cells. And this is why you start seeing a very like sharp drop in your glucose as soon as you start exercising. And you can experience low blood glucose. But that's not the whole picture. That's like kind of the very first starting point. So with exercise, you have lots of different considerations to take into account that impact the way that your glucose responds. So the first one could be intensity of exercise. This is really important because the intensity of exercise will impact other hormones that are released in your body. So if you do a high intensity bout of exercise, what happens is that your body triggers an adrenaline response. It starts releasing other hormones that cause like this kind of really kind of action to sort of be ready for these like explosive events. So for example, if you were to start sprinting, and what adrenaline does, in addition to other effects that it has, is it acts on the liver and it stimulates the liver to release glucose directly into the bloodstream. So when you start exercising, you have a situation where your blood glucose shoots up very rapidly. But on the other end, if you just start walking or you start doing a very low intensity cycle, you don't have so much of an increase in these hormones like adrenaline. You might have a little bit, but not really enough to have this kind of big effect. You have this increase in this non-insulin stimulated glucose uptake, and especially if you have insulin on board. So if you've recently given yourself insulin to cover a meal or something like that, the insulin and the contractions add together to pull your glucose down. And this is why in exercise, you really have this huge increased risk in low blood glucose or hypoglycemia. And as a result, I mean, I don't want to push forward too much, but this is why with type 1 diabetes, you really get this kind of fear of hypoglycemia around exercise. And you have this real challenge of managing blood glucose around exercise. And as a consequence, lots of people, when they're first diagnosed, stop, or they just kind of really struggle to manage this situation.
So what's the right thing to do? How do we, one, get over that fear of hypoglycemia that comes from exercises, or maybe exercising too intensely, too quickly, and what can we do?
So there's the first thing to say is like it's definitely possible to exercise. It's definitely possible to exercise every day. It's definitely possible to reach a truly elite level in sport if you want to. This doesn't have to stop somebody with type 1 diabetes from doing sport. And actually, it's something that should definitely be encouraged and incorporated. It's something that has a huge impact on your health in general. It's something that can really help with blood glucose management, both from kind of being able to manage the glucose on a physiological level, but also by better understanding your own body and the way that your body is responding to nutrition and the insulin you're administering, and just kind of being more aware of how exercise impacts this can also have a big positive impact. So the first thing is really kind of having a solid way of monitoring your glucose. So being on top of that, either having access to a continuous glucose monitor if you're able to, or just being really kind of sort of good at keeping track of your glucose if you're unable to, if you're using finger sticks, and making sure that your kind of management from an insulin administration point of view, that you're kind of comfortable with that, and also with nutrition in general. Then the next stage about exercise is kind of understanding how different components can impact your glucose and impact your physiology under different situations. There's a lot of kind of education that's required here, a lot of kind of monitoring patterns of what happens under different situations. There are some resources that you can find. There are resources that you can get from your doctor, but the resources, I would say, quite honestly, are lacking in this area, and this is why I had a big motivation to do what I'm currently doing, which we could go into later. But it's basically around understanding how type of exercise impacts your glucose. Very simple level is kind of generally lower intensity exercise over a longer period will cause your glucose to go lower. High intensity explosive will cause your glucose to go higher. Being aware of insulin that you're taking, the nutrition that you're taking, it's a complicated thing. You'd have to really go into a lot of details about this on an individual level, but it's basically about kind of education, spotting patterns, and coming up with a good routine.
So you said the intensity of exercise is going to affect your blood glucose levels. Is there other considerations around exercise, if we talk about resistance training, for example, or other modes of training that have different impacts on that?
Yeah, resistance training there's very limited research on resistance training, like lab or clinical studies. There are some. The other main important factors are time of day has an important influence. So there are studies looking at the impact of doing the same type of exercise in the morning versus in the evening. The timing at which you take in insulin in relation to the exercise that you're doing. This is because if you have insulin that you've taken as somebody with type 1 diabetes, your body doesn't react in the same way, in that it as somebody who produces their own, in that when you've administered the insulin, it's kind of going to stay in your body for a little while. And then if you start exercising in a window that's too close to that, you have those two additive mechanisms of the non-insulin mediated glucose uptake and the insulin mediated. You add them together and it's kind of a recipe for kind of a very sharp decrease in blood glucose levels. So
right.
That's really important.
Okay. And so what are the signs of hypoglycemia, and can somebody imagine somebody without, and I've seen it before, somebody without diabetes can also experience hypoglycemia, especially if they're not trained and they do something hard, or can you talk about that? What are the signs of hypoglycemia, and do they present differently in diabetic populations versus non-diabetic?
Yeah, so there'll be slightly different according to the individual, but in general, it will be things like tremoring, feeling sort of like lightheaded. Then you can get things where your sort of speech is slurred, sort of your it's basically a consequence of not receiving enough glucose to the brain. So your body starts to do that. And over the next stage is kind of if it gets worse, it could be that you faint, and worst case scenario would be coma. As somebody who doesn't have diabetes, it's possible to experience, but in general, it's going to be much, much rarer because your body just has these mechanisms that are there as a safety mechanism to prevent this. When it's possible that your glucose might go a bit lower. You might feel, okay, I feel a bit low, but you're not going to go as low as somebody who has type 1 diabetes. You're not going to experience the same thing. And even if you do start to go lower, beyond a certain threshold, an adrenaline response is going to kick in, which is just going to solve that. So it's, yeah, it's not going to become like that life-threatening situation.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Now, when it comes to nutrition, what can we do in that regard with for type 1 diabetics, and thinking around exercise as well, now that we're starting to put all those pieces together?
Okay, so this is like a sort of a massive sort of
Pandora's box.
Yeah, but no, it's really interesting. So it depends on the individual, depends on your goals, in terms of goals for if you're an athlete, if you're not an athlete. Generally speaking, somebody with type 1 diabetes should have like no restrictions in terms of like the myths you hear or ideas that you hear where people say, oh, you can't eat sugar if you have type 1 diabetes, or people saying, why are you eating that? You can't do that. There's nothing like that. There's no reason for anybody to feel that they can't eat. That being said, it's the same as everybody. Like having a sensible, healthy diet is something I'd recommend. It's not that just because you can manage your blood glucose by administering additional insulin to cover that you could just do that. It's just about like having a healthy kind of diet that's balanced, same as what you would recommend for anybody else. In terms of like a sporting perspective, like if you were to take somebody who's training, that will depend on the sport that they're interested in. So if you're an endurance athlete, you would have a diet which is very different from a power, like a power lifter, or somebody who's doing like a power-based sport, or somebody who's looking to maintain a certain amount of muscle mass. Like maybe they're a rugby player, maybe they're doing some other sport which is requiring them to have a certain amount of muscle mass. Or on the other side, maybe you're doing a sport which is requires sort of body weight management because it's important for your sport. Like if you're a boxer who needs to kind of make weight in certain situations, or if you're cycling, you need to manage your weight in accordance so that you're kind of having a really good power to weight ratio. When it comes to type 1 diabetes, the most important thing is that your blood glucose is in a range that is safe for you. So you're always kind of managing that for your health to make sure that you're not experiencing too much hyper or hypoglycemia. Aside from that, as an athlete or somebody who's interested in sport, you're looking for ways to optimize your nutrition for fueling and also body composition. And that will be based on those particular demands. So it's just a case of balancing an additional factor, but it's not like a different diet is required.
Yeah, it's good to hear, and it's good to highlight the fact that type 1 diabetics can eat a broad spectrum of foods. They just have to take extra consideration of their own situation, their own blood glucose levels, and where that stands relative to insulin I guess utilization, and then exercise. And so there's a few more variables that they need to play with when it comes to choosing the right thing at the right time, which is tricky. But it's good that you're saying, it can be done. It can be done, and it's accessible to everyone. One thing I didn't ask before: if a type 1 diabetic is exercising and maybe it was too hard too soon, maybe it was too close to the previous insulin shot. So you're going through a hypoglycemic phase. What do you do practically? How do you get out of it?
So you would it's glucose. So you would look to have like most people who have type 1 diabetes will have very close to them like glucose tablets or like juice, something like that. So you're looking for a very fast acting glucose to counteract that. Basically, your priority is just avoid hypoglycemia. Yeah.
Okay. So again, just get out of that edge state, let's call it, and come back to that safe range. And this is really what you need to be thinking about at all times, is staying within that safe range, not going too high, not going too low. And that's where I imagine the continuous glucose monitors become an important tool along with that, right?
Yeah. So with that, it depends a bit. So if you're experiencing that like in normal average daily life, then that's the situation. And obviously you would want to look to reduce your risk of that by anticipating it, by being aware of what's going on. If you are in a sporting situation, if you're in a competition or something like that, the planning, like while you are doing the competition, is very important, because if you experience hypoglycemia during a competitive event, so for example, if you were a cyclist, the chances of you being able to kind of really recover from that and continue competing at the level to compete against somebody who does not have diabetes is really, really difficult. So yeah, exactly. Continuous glucose monitors are amazing in that they are allowing this fantastic insight, not only for sort of reducing the amount of finger prick samples which are required. So this is something that is a big problem. So imagine having to stick your fingers like 10 times a day. It's something that's really not a pleasant thing to have to do for the rest of your life. This is something. So continuous glucose monitors are fantastic from that. They also allow the opportunity to see the direction in which your glucose is trending. So most of them have arrows. When you see the screen of what it will show your glucose, and it will show the way that it's trending. If it's trending down, that gives you important information where you can sort of consider next steps a little bit more in anticipation. And nowadays, it's possible to do this quite often during exercise, either having your glucose monitor linked up to a watch, if you're able to wear the watch in the sport you're competing in, or like on a cycling computer, something like that. It's really important for like planning and being able to make those adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really important to put forward. You worked as a head of research, right, for Team Novo Nordisk, which is a type 1 diabetes only team, if I understand correctly. So first of all, how did you end up working with that team, and what talk about that experience first, working
Mhm.
with such a team, which is completely out of the ordinary, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so Team Novo Nordisk is an all diabetes professional cycling team. Um, so the way that I got involved at the end, towards the end of when I was doing my PhD, as I said, I became really passionate around type 1 diabetes. I was spending a lot of time in the lab doing these exercise interventions where we were really focusing on the idea of how do we help the regular person get into exercise? How do we help the person who's new to exercise to understand the impact of different intensities of exercise on their glucose, so that we can build up sort of a better picture to build guidelines around that. What I experienced in that situation was um, that it's really challenging, like really challenging. The number of times that we would have to cancel study visits because somebody was experiencing hypoglycemia, so we would have to kind of change. And as I say, I don't live with type 1 diabetes. This was only a small window, but I was seeing how difficult that was like. And then towards the end of my PhD, I saw a video of these guys from Team Novo Nordisk cycling up a mountain. And I was like, this doesn't match up with what I'm seeing every day. I need to find out how this is doing this, like how this is working, because I want to be able to transfer that into what I'm doing every day. So I got in contact with them through different sort of circumstances. After going to Toronto, the lab I was working in was a really good lab around exercise and type 1 diabetes. Just basically taking chances in the fact of like sort of volunteering to things and going to different things. I found myself in a situation where I started going to these camps, and then just kind of long story short, it wasn't really planned. After being in Toronto, I actually was offered a position at Cornell in New York. I was going to go and work there, and it was something where it was in a different area to what I'd previously been working, but it was a good position. And maybe 2 or 3 weeks before going, I gave a presentation at a large diabetes conference, and sitting kind of like in the audience was who turned out to be my next sort of boss in Bern in Switzerland. He asked me what I was doing. He said he would like me to come to Switzerland to lead this like clinical group, and then in the same room, sitting opposite, was Phil, who's the CEO of Team Novo Nordisk, and said, "No, I would like Sam to work for me." And within a couple of hours, they said, "Here's the offer. We want you to do 50% where you are working with the team, so that we can better understand what's going on here, and move to Switzerland, where we'll set up this new exercise clinical group." And I was like, this is sort of a dream situation where I get to understand what's happening on both ends of this kind of exercise spectrum, of the elite level and also the like clinical level. And that's how I got in that situation. So this is a team who are competing against so they're like a top professional cycling team. They're competing in top stage races against other athletes. All of the athletes on this team have type 1 diabetes. All of them are having to manage their glucose on the bike, administer insulin, etc., manage their nutrition around performance, as well as safe blood glucose management. And then the athletes they're competing against don't have to think about this stuff. All they're doing is just the relatively easy task of cycling for like 5 hours a day, day after day, around the world. So yeah, it was a very cool experience, and a very unique insight to these different things.
What changed in your understanding of type 1 diabetes and the role of exercise once you started working with those guys?
Yeah, I have to kind of think back to what it was. I mean, I think it's fantastic to be able to really see that the limits kind of disappear in terms of what's possible, in that it is possible to sit on a bike for 5 hours. It is possible to do this day after day and manage this safely. There are strategies that can be put in place. It highlighted to me how little work had been done in this area in terms of clear sort of protocol or strategy for how to manage this. The majority of the kind of ways in which these guys were managing their glucose was on a very personal level with themselves. Like, they had figured out something that worked for them. They were working with their own diabetes doctor, but the majority of kind of the strategy, the sort of protocol, if you like, was self-developed by each athlete. There isn't, like, within the team, like, this is what you do. There were very clear sort of unanswered questions around what is the best nutrition to use, what is the best way to administer insulin, like the type of therapy, what is the best sort of training strategy or post-exercise strategy that you should do. There was all of these questions, and I also found it fantastically, kind of from a as a physiologist, you're in a situation where you're working with a group of athletes where they have to fine-tune so much around their physiology and their performance. Like, if you speak to anybody who works in pro cycling in general, they will say the same thing. Cycling is a sport where you can't like take anything for granted the night before. Like, in other sports, there is a bit of leeway where you can get your nutrition a bit wrong, or you can miss a training session or something like that. But in pro cycling, you cannot do that. And you put on top of that the type 1 diabetes element, in terms of like the amount of kind of focus on this that's required from a physiological perspective, highlighting the impact of different situations throughout somebody's day that can impact health, performance. Somebody's body composition is really really interesting. Like, one factor might be what you do after a competition or a training session. And when you think of the different elements that would be built into an athlete without type 1 diabetes sort of routine, you start to think, hang on, this is having a big impact potentially on glucose. So things like if you include a cool down or you don't. So that cool down is exercise, which is having an impact on the glucose that's being taken up into the muscle. If you include it or you don't, if you have type 1 diabetes, you have to consider that. You also have to consider the type of nutrition that you're taking, alongside the insulin timing as well, because you're wanting to refuel in order to compete the following day. And this is involving, like, thinking about the insulin that you take on and the other macronutrients that you take on, such as protein, which is important for kind of the the repair, the recovery, that kind of thing, and how that's impacting the insulin that's being administered, and then also how you're managing the risk of hypoglycemia overnight, because doing heavy exercise like this day after day, you're depleting glycogen stores, you're increasing your insulin sensitivity. If you don't adapt your insulin accordingly, your risk of hypoglycemia or your impact that's having on your sleep overnight is massive. And one of the first things that we noticed when we started doing this was just sticking a glucose monitor on these guys and looking at what happened overnight. We very broadly saw like a pattern of increased risk of low blood glucose while they were sleeping. And the guys that they're competing against every day, they don't have to deal with this. They're not experiencing that. But these guys were like a higher risk of hypos overnight, and they were experiencing hypos overnight. This is going to impact the rate of recovery. It's going to impact your sleep. And this is a huge disadvantage unless you get this right. So this whole experience highlighted really like the sort of importance of taking all of these different factors, but also the such open questions that we don't have answers to, and like the complexity of how these guys are still managing to do it.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. If we take a couple of those factors and just compare them to what is done in, let's call it regular or non-diabetic professional cycling. If we think about training, so the types of sessions, the duration of sessions, the organization of the sessions in the week, what are the main differences that you might see between somebody who trains with type 1 diabetes in that sport versus someone who doesn't when it comes to those different training sessions?
Okay. Well, let's
broad picture.
If we try and simplify by keeping to cycling,
yes,
because
let's keep to cycling.
if you open it up to any other sport, it will be completely different.
Fair.
So these guys are doing very similar training regimes to other athletes. They'll always need to consider like the glucose management, of course, the nutrition, that kind of thing. But there's other things which, unfortunately, I didn't have time while I was working there, because it would take years and years. It's something I'm still interested in and we're still working on in different capacities. But things like how you optimize your fueling around certain key training sessions to optimize the sort of adaptive response to that. And what I mean by this is there's a lot of evidence in people who don't have diabetes that they would manipulate their diet around key training sessions in order to maximize certain metabolic adaptation. So there is examples of people doing fasted exercise training. There's examples of people training twice a day, because there's evidence that this, especially when you're exercising in a glycogen depleted state, that you're sort of hitting other pathways which are stimulating increased like adaptation for endurance training. But the other thing that you have to take into account is that with type 1 diabetes, you can't just take for granted your nutrition or your insulin and just say, I'm going to do a fasted training session right now. Like me and you, we don't live with type 1 diabetes. If somebody said to you right now, assuming you hadn't had breakfast, let's go for a fasted training session, there's nothing that's going to go wrong from like a hypoglycemia perspective. Like you're not in risk of that at all. You could also train this morning fasted, and then you could train this afternoon fasted as well. It's very kind of simple, but if you're living with type 1 diabetes, you have to take this into account. On the other hand, there are certain exercise sessions where you need to do it at a higher intensity, and you cannot get to that higher intensity without carbohydrates. Like you need to fuel appropriately in order to do that. So maybe you're doing like HIIT workout, or you're doing sprinting, or you're doing just like a higher intensity workout. You need to be fueled appropriately for that. And so with type 1 diabetes, to shift between these different types of training is something that you could not take for granted. There's other aspects as well. So like if you wanted to take into account the stage that you are over your training season, that kind of thing. So you'll have points of the season whereby you're looking to do long sessions, you're building up like your endurance. You maybe don't need to kind of concentrate so much on hitting those higher intensities, but you'll have other sessions where you're looking to cut down on your weight. You're looking to manage that weight, and in order to manage that, you want to be having a balance whereby you're fueled to hit the intensity, but you're not taking on too many carbohydrates that your weight becomes unmanageable. And this is a difficult balance to get because all of the time you've got to avoid hypoglycemia. And another example might be if you want to incorporate carbohydrate loading into like your strategy. There you really need to think about, okay, I want to reduce my carbohydrates. How do I adjust my insulin so that I'm not really high in that period where you're kind of lower, while keeping your training at this point that you want to do? And then you're loading, you're going to be needing to adjust your insulin again. How do you manage that so that you're kind of in peak performance? It's complicated.
It's a real balancing act, the way you're describing it, and really trying to manage all those parameters that will influence it. Something came to mind, and since you did you do any of the testing with the team, or were you mainly on the research side, or were you close to the trainers and the physiologists that took care of the testing with those guys?
Yeah, so you mean in terms of like performance testing, VO2 max testing, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I had what came to mind is what does all of this how does all this affect lactate levels in the blood? And does that have any repercussions on testing and considerations around testing cyclists with type 1 diabetes?
Okay, so yeah, in terms of the physiology testing, no, you can get reasonable looking uh, lactate tests, performing max tests. There's no problem doing that. The athletes would experience no challenge. They were very kind of experienced with doing it. It was very routine for them. No problem with pushing themselves. No kind of particularly weird results that you see on the lactate front. These guys are just very trained, so you see that they hit those lactate thresholds much higher than somebody who's not trained. But yeah, the results are quite similar to what we would see in an athlete without.
Right. And the potential variation in glucose levels inside the blood doesn't have a direct impact on the lactate concentration from the fact that, and correct me if I'm off, but because of the lactate that we measure in the blood comes primarily from the muscle itself. And if we're at a low enough intensity, the muscle can recycle it. If we get out of that low intensity, now it starts showing into the blood because the muscle can't manage it all by itself. So it kind of passes the baton onwards to the rest of the body. And then obviously at high intensity, those values go up. But so there's no link between the glucose level inside the blood itself and the lactate levels that are measured. Is that correct?
There will be a link.
Right.
I don't, to be honest, I don't know too much about this exactly. It's also difficult to directly see the link given the timing of which samples are taken, like being really able to to get into that. But in terms of the testing that we were doing, there was no kind of
No major differences.
no major difference to what you would see in an athlete that doesn't have type 1.
Well, I can't wait for those constant lactate monitors to show up and be able to put them next to that glucose monitor and see how those curves interact. I think, I mean, that's something that's always been interesting to me is you look at lactate at a given moment in time, but like you said before, you mentioned the arrows and the trend and knowing where it's coming from and where it's going and
Mhm.
why that is really interesting. So I guess we'll just have to wait a little bit for that. To close that little chapter on your experience with the professional cycling team, what were your main takeaways that you transfer now into your everyday work that you learned with those guys?
Well, so as you know, like what I'm doing now, so I left both of these positions to focus on my startup, which is called Enhanced.
Hmm.
What we're doing here is we're trying to create a solution to help people really get the insights behind what's impacting their glucose. I recognized that when we were working with athletes, this isn't just Team Novo Nordisk, but there was other athletes that I worked with, being able to match the data from glucose monitors with nutrition people are taking on, with insulin, with the exercise itself. There's no clear way for people to kind of contextualize that. That was
Hmm.
really something that is not existing at the moment. So that decision making around all of these complex aspects is requiring you just to kind of remember everything and just somehow have a massive kind of store of information about every single scenario that could happen. I
Hmm.
mean, we only just scratched the surface, but I think I was going into all kinds of different areas of what can impact glucose. And then on the other side, the clinical work I was doing. So here, what I was doing was a lot of studies that were testing the impact of different nutritional measures. So, like what happens when you have caffeine in connection with exercise? What
Hmm.
happens if you do a higher intensity or a lower intensity exercise? All of these different things, but you're you're taking this information from a very, very small group of people that taken part in a study, and then trying to somehow um, uh, um, sort of apply that to a like a consensus or a way of helping everybody who's living with type 1 diabetes.
Hmm.
So I felt that there was really a need to put together uh, a, like a tool that would help the individual living with type 1 to recognize what impact all these bits of information were having on their glucose, so that they could then go on and make the decision and start exercising themselves. So they could recognize um, what happens when they exercise at a specific time of day in relation to another. What happens if they take their insulin 30 minutes before exercise as opposed to an hour and a half before exercise? All of these different things.
Hmm.
I recognized that if I was to carry on along the current path that I was going, the work was just moving at a very slow pace to be able to have this kind of real impact in people's lives. So that was why it was like, if somebody's going to sort of create a tool that does this together, we need to do this ourselves. So I
Hmm.
would say that was a big take home.
Right. So the main driver, essentially, you scratched an itch by building this software and helping type 1 diabetics and diabetics in general have a almost like a dashboard to help them figure out all those variables and how they interact and essentially enhance decision making, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so the way that we see it is continuous glucose monitors we've mentioned here.
Yeah.
Um, these are a fantastic tool. Um, and more and more people, especially with type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, are having access to them. But the actionability, the ability to really understand what is impacting your glucose and how you can expect your glucose to respond, especially around exercise, which is so complex.
Mm.
It's a behavior that people want to do all of the time. People maybe want to do it every day. But if you don't understand the tool that's presented to you, you're unable to use it. The analogy we would use is that this hardware is like people being given access to the latest iPhone, but they're still on Windows 95. They're not able to understand what this technology can provide them. And this is what we want to do.
Right. The data is one thing. Knowing what to do with the data is a completely different conversation. It's the same in testing. You can measure all those different things. Then you have, muscle oximeters and all those cool things you can use. But then you have, 2 data points per second for a whole hour of training. And what do you actually do with this? It doesn't, it's not self-explanatory. So
That's exactly.
I can imagine how having that place to aggregate all the information and help decision making is important. But before we talk about that, can we quickly touch on type 2 diabetes
Yeah.
and briefly go over the main differences? Because I think you did a great job going over type 1 and explaining all the considerations around exercise, around nutrition. Um, how is type 2 diabetes different than type 1 when it comes to managing it, especially around those two variables, which are exercise and nutrition?
Yeah. So type 2 diabetes, um, it will be very individual specific.
Hmm.
So, as I said, type 2 diabetes is a chronic condition, tends to be associated with um, certain lifestyle factors. And this can mean that the person is like carrying more weight or has other complications, which they need to make sure that they take into account before starting exercise. So somebody with type 2 diabetes, what I would recommend before starting exercise is really speaking to your doctor to understand where you are with it, because there's factors to take into account, like if you're taking certain medications, if you have certain risk factors, like cardiovascular risk factors, remembering that a lot of people are over 40, 50, 60 living with type 2. So not wanting to suddenly start doing something that you're not used to. You also have uh, some medications that might lead to like a risk of hypoglycemia. Is something that you need to take into account if you're doing exercise. Um, Also, just knowing your history in general about like joint issues, that kind of thing. Just sort of understanding that.
Hmm.
So that would be the first thing that I would recommend, and it depends as well in terms of a blood glucose management perspective, where you are in terms of how you manage that. Like maybe you're not taking insulin, maybe you're able to manage it through nutrition, maybe you're looking to incorporate exercise as a way to manage your weight, to lose weight. So then it's really a case of figuring out what your goals are with this. Like maybe it's to incorporate exercise for general well-being, to improve like your cardiovascular fitness. Um, the recommendations for people with type 2 diabetes is about kind of incorporating like between like 60, 90 minutes of exercise on most days of the week. You also want to incorporate some kind of resistance training exercise because you want to maintain muscle mass, and then also flexibility and those kind of things. But yeah, main thing I would say is just understanding where you are with it.
Because it's very individual and the approach will vary depending on where you sit on that spectrum.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Let's switch to talk about the what you're developing with Enhanced D. And so it's a software that allows better diabetic management to a holistic approach, including different data sources. So talk to us about when did you start that project?
So we started this around 2 years ago now. There's 5 of us working on this project. as I said previously, the goal here was really to make exercise easier for people with diabetes, taking advantage of different technologies that are now very commonly available. So continuous glucose monitors, exercise wearables, and also insulin delivery devices, so pens and pumps. Finding a way to put this information together, but in a very user-friendly way, not in an over-clinical way, in a way which is available on your mobile phone that seamlessly integrates this data, that doesn't require any kind of coding skills or additional steps to follow. Then when you have that information together, you can start understanding how your glucose response is impacted by all of these different factors. So currently, we're at a situation where we've released our app. It's on the App Store. People can download it now. It allows you to integrate a wide variety of like wearables, like if you're wearing smartwatches, if you're using a continuous glucose monitor, puts the information together. And the idea is that it provides context there. The next stages of this will be moving more into suggestions and insights around your data. So being able to really provide information about what had happened to you during different types of training and exercise, so that the patterns are sort of put together for you. So you can better kind of have your own sort of library of how you tend to respond. And then the other aspect to what we've created as well is a dashboard to really help clinicians. So what we didn't want to do here was create something which was cutting clinicians out of the picture. It's really important that the clinicians are supported in this, and also that they're provided a tool to better understand exercise and glucose. So unfortunately, a lot of clinicians don't get too much information around exercise, especially like exercise and glucose management. As a consequence, when people are first diagnosed, a lot of people stop because it's kind of I've heard many times
that way,
it's
right?
yeah, it's
It's
easier.
one less
Let's just
variables to
wait.
play with.
Yeah, let's just wait until things settle down, and then maybe we can think about it. Or let's not talk about that kind of thing. It's too complex. So our idea is that we have a tool which is organizing the data within the clinics and also providing the contextual information, so that when the person living with diabetes goes to see their clinician, they're speaking the same language because they're seeing the same information. They're able to have a conversation where they can kind of say, these are the particular challenges around this aspect of my lifestyle. This is what I want to work on. Because previously, what is happening, or currently what is happening until this gets kind of rolled out more widely, is that the doctor is seeing a trace with no context. And then they are asking the person who's with them for like the 15-minute session, what happened here 3 months ago? Right. It's like, I don't know. It was something that nobody can remember, but by having the information together, you can come up with a plan, which is really going to help. And the other thing is as well, that by putting this information together, we're able to help the actual individual rather than, and this was a bit of a frustration of mine, where doing clinical research is great, but you're working on very small sample sizes, which are quite often not representative of the wider group. Very often male-only student age population that you're then hoping to kind of build consensus to apply to everybody. So with our app, what you can do is start learning from yourself. You can start having information from yourself. So you're just getting just like a more precise insight into how you can expect your glucose to work. And the final thing I think is just shining a light on the importance of exercise in people's lives, and the kind of the willingness or that want to live an active life that many people have. They'll go and see their doctor, they'll say exercise, this is the big factor that I'm struggling with, and they're not receiving the information that they want. And by showing, look, exercise, I'm doing it every single day, let's have a conversation about this, it's something that we feel will help people to be much more active.
Yeah, you've been repeating from the beginning. It's an N of one type of thing where everybody reacts slightly differently. We need to approach it on the individual level. And yes, we can learn from population level studies and looking more broadly, but every individual has to manage that at their own level, in their own context, within what they eat, what they do for work, what they do for exercise, and I could see how again, having a place where all this is brought together with hopefully some in the future some indications as to what you could do, what you should do, because that's the hardest part, the decision making based on the data that you have. That is really cool, and I like also the bridging the gap between the patient and the clinician, and trying to look at that at diabetes and at how diabetes affects somebody's life in general at different from different perspectives, because having a different perspective on the same problem will allow us to probably learn faster and make this whole area move more quickly.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. I mean, as to really like passionate about sport, it's important that upon a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes that you recognize you can continue doing the activity that you want to do. And there's lots of examples of people doing it, and that you feel kind of empowered to do that.
Did you get some good feedback already from some of your users on what it allows them to do and how it's enhanced their experience living with diabetes?
Yeah, so far the reception has been really good. So um, we released it publicly on the app stores the other week. We have over 1,000 people using it already. We are very keen to develop this alongside people who are using it. So we have a number of WhatsApp groups where we're regularly receiving feedback. We have a very clear system to get feedback. We're also we've published publicly online what features we're planning, what we're working on. We want this to be something where people say, can you change this? And we actually do it. And we also want to be quite sort of open with the direction that we're going with the product development, because if we're able to get the meaningful feedback, we just make it better. And then that kind of increases the adoption, the amount that it can help. So it's kind of a cycle that we want to sort of feed forward through the way we're developing it.
If you could think ahead 5 years, maybe 10 years in the future, what would you like to see around what you're building here, around the software, the app, and how it impacts people's lives?
Um, Firstly, I want it to really be as a way to continue to show that you can keep doing exercise regularly, whatever you're interested in. Like on the app, we have people who are very high level athletes, but we also have people who might see it as a way to kind of encourage them to start doing their first 5K. That's what we want to encourage. We're not just interested in people who are already exercising. We want to introduce people to start. I mean, on the technical development of it, we have some really cool ideas that we're wanting to implement. This week, we're releasing some new features which will have the sleep and glucose insights together. So I believe we're the first group to do this, to put this out, where it's got sleep, glucose together. And we're aiming to have this really complete kind of picture of everything that's happening there. You see that technologies on different forms of AI are developing extremely quickly. By having this information together, forming the foundation, we're also confident that the suggestions that we can start providing based on an individual's data can only get better and better, especially as that access to technology improves. So, yeah, we're very confident that we can put something together that's going to have a meaningful impact.
That's really cool. And there's from a user standpoint, there's nothing better than an app or a software that you give recommendations to and they actually implement it. There's yeah, it's so cool to see that dynamic interaction. And I like that you're making a point of putting that high on your list of priorities and getting the feedback from your users, implementing it, making it better. It's an iterative process anyway, right? You kind of have to go through that, and if you can do it with the people that are using it and need it every day, then you can obviously do a much better job of it. Now, if you had a chance to share some thoughts with maybe some of your colleagues, researchers, coaches, trainers, doctors, and clinicians, what studies would you like to see done in that field currently so that you guys can better understand diabetes and its management around health and sports?
I mean, I think there's lots of questions I have, but from a very kind, it's maybe not the most impactful in terms of it leading to something that's going to be kind of like a cure or something like this, which I think is course like really important. But I'm really interested in like the cross between performance and type 1 diabetes, the things that we discussed before in terms of sports performance,
Mm.
in terms of how you optimize different areas of your nutritional strategies, your training implementation, because this information as well, I think, would be so fascinating to apply to people who don't have type 1 diabetes, because by better understanding all of these bits that are affected during like even a post exercise, as I said before, how you optimize your insulin in
Mm.
relation to glycogen resynthesis, in relation to taking on the protein that's required to recover, in relation to how you get your sleep strategy right, not just from a glucose management perspective, but from a total routine point of view, how you incorporate other aspects like a cool down, like what's the best type of thing. Those types of questions really captured me, and I found that no one had really been asking these questions before. I had lots of questions around nutrition, not just from like a normal sort of what's the best kind of healthy, balanced diet perspective, but how do we manipulate diet in a way which is giving you the energy that you need for a given training session, which is helping you to sort of optimize metabolic adaptations that take place, because we know that your nutrition impacts the way that your body responds to an exercise stimulus, but at the same time making sure that you're meeting your fuel requirements to exercise. There's so many of these factors, and these are the questions that I'm interested in.
Mm.
And unfortunately, there's not so many people looking at these direct questions. Maybe because they're kind of a smaller sort of number of athletes it would apply to. But I think that those are fascinating.
Well, I hope that some people pick up the ball and run with it and try to push in those different directions. Sam, it's been a big pleasure having you on, and I've learned a lot about diabetes and everything that surrounds it. If you had some closing words for people that live with diabetes every day, what would your words be to those folks?
Um, I mean, again, like if we're talking about type 1 diabetes, I mean, it's really important. I don't live with type 1 diabetes, and it's important. I recognize that um, it's not really possible for me to fully understand the daily challenges that entails. I have tried to put myself in that shoe. I do really appreciate the challenges in the fact that, and this is demonstrated by the fact that I'm really passionate towards working to ways in which to help with solutions, especially around exercise, because this is something I have in my control. But in terms of any advice or something like that, I don't think I'm in the place to do it. I'm not somebody who's who can really put myself in those shoes. The only thing I would say is that if you're thinking about doing exercise, if you're wanting to, it's just the fact that I've seen it's possible to do any type of exercise, definitely possible to live a healthy, active lifestyle. There's lots of community groups in which you can engage with to find other people who do live with type 1 and are able to support you. So I would suggest probably seek out other people and try and learn from them.
That's awesome. So I'll make sure we list all the information in the description regarding your app and where it can be found on the App Store and probably the Android store as well. And I'll include your Instagram and some other links if people want to get in touch with you or want to learn more about what you do. Again, Sam, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about this with us today.
Thanks, Sean. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. See you soon. Before I let you go, I want to tell you a little bit more about this podcast sponsor. All You Need Nutrition is a high-quality supplement brand proudly made in France. When they first reached out to me, my wife, who's a trained nutritionist, had a lot of questions about the different ingredients that they use. So we scheduled a call with Miriam, the mastermind behind the entire All You Need product line. After the call that lasted almost 2 hours, my wife was really impressed by their transparency and the quality of their products. She was excited to work with a brand like All You Need. And if my wife says yes to a supplement brand, I'm on board without hesitation. Personally, I love their whey protein. I use it after every strength session or mix it in with my yogurt in the morning when I want a little extra protein. It's not too sweet, the cocoa flavor is delicious, and it blends really well. Their one product is fantastic if you're looking for a light energy boost plus all the vitamins and minerals you might need if you're used to training hard. My wife sticks to 1 scoop, but I go for 2. Make sure you find the dose that works for you. And special shout out to their shaker bottle. It's literally the best shaker I've used in the past 15 years. We've been using their supplements for the last 2 months and we're genuinely thrilled to be working with them. If you want to support the podcast, click the link in the description to check out their whole product line and use the code UPSIDE for 10% off on your next order with All You Need Nutrition. Take care and see you in the next episode.